the great rapprochement. It was Ed Miliband who said to Andy Burnham, if you're looking for a really exciting hire, you should think about my brother David, to whom I am speaking once again.
Let's talk about this incredible cliffhanger that is the Labour leadership contest. We don't quite know how it's going to pan out. Andy Burnham has been backed by 322 out of 402 Labour MPs. That means 82 MPs haven't yet committed. 81 could nominate another candidate. So it sounded, I compared it a bit to North Korea in my introduction. People were queuing up sort of before dawn. I think 2 MPs went in at the same time, but one filled out his form more quickly than the other, and then the floodgates opened.
Yeah, Barry Gardner and David Pinto Dukevsky are competing to be the most derided by colleagues for their toadying. They're the 2 MPs of whom you're speaking. There was another, Luke Charters, who was forced to deny that he had asked specifically for the Parliamentary Labour Party office to open early so he could be the first person. He had to deny that on the record. So there is this sort of great tidal wave of obsequiousness, Ed, that is Andy Burnham is drowning under. You mentioned North Korea. I have to pull you up on that. In North Korea, they do go through the motions of putting up regime-sponsored alternative parties. There's a social democratic party. There's parties for minority groups. It's all a sham, of course. But the Labour Party hasn't even done that this time.
So it is an essay in obsequiousness. I mean, one of the people who is putting his toe in the water and flirting with Andy Burnham is David Miliband. He's over in London. He's given a lecture in London. He's spoken warmly about Andy Burnham's devolution agenda. Should we read something into this? I mean, it seems extraordinary that he'd be appointed Foreign Secretary on one level, but on the other hand, he has got serious experience.
Yeah, and if you consider that Andy Burnham wants to focus on domestic policy, having an experienced Foreign Secretary is essential. Now, you can read that one of 2 ways. You can say, well, he needs continuity in the office. So Yvette Cooper should stay. She has all the relationships with people. She can pick up that brief and run with it. And given what we read in his article in The Times earlier this week, Andy Burnham, there doesn't seem to be a huge change in substance, rather a change of emphasis and presentation in the foreign policy stuff and the defence policy stuff. Or you could say, well, I need an even bigger hitter because I'm not going to touch this at all. Is Ed Miliband, is Dave Miliband a bigger hitter than Yvette Cooper? I mean, Yvette Cooper's been Foreign Secretary for a while. Dave Miliband hasn't been Foreign Secretary for a long time, but I think the media will get much more excited about that. Not sure that a Republican White House would, but that's a moot point. But look, David Miliband is part of this conversation, has been part of this conversation for several weeks, and as I revealed a week or so ago, we have Ed Miliband to thank for that. The great rapprochement. It was Ed Miliband who said to Andy Burnham, if you're looking for a really exciting hire, you should think about my brother David, to whom I am speaking once again.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, indeed.
That's really interesting. I mean, actually, since you mentioned Ed Miliband, we might as well do it. I mean, my view is he's nailed on as Chancellor.
I veer back and forth on this in the absence of any guidance from Andy Burnham. It depends what time of day you're asking me, and you're asking me at a time of day when I'm sort of less certain on Ed Miliband. But there have been days where I have sort of laid down my half drunken pint of Guinness and gesticulated wildly at my drinking companions on the terrace and said Ed is going to be Chancellor. And there have been murmurs of agreement, and others I've furrowed my brow and sipped pensively on my pint of Guinness and said, I don't know, I just can't see it. And it's hard for me to admit ignorance on this question, because what's the point of me if I don't know the answers to this question? But occasionally I get I get texts from people who do know these things or are privy to these conversations that say, it's just Ed and a disobliging emoji, or an emoji that implies finality, right? The Ed thing is over. On other occasions, I get worried texts from people saying, oh God, Ed's back in the conversation. So who knows.
Yeah, no, to a certain extent, that may well reflect Andy Burnham's position. Now, Louise Haigh, who is his sort of right-hand woman, she's the former Transport Secretary and backed him when he first stood for leader, I think. She gave this very interesting interview to the BBC. Let's hear a clip.
He has been thinking about this and certainly planning for this moment for at least the last year.
Yeah. So meeting with you, meeting with others, saying, if it happens, what do we do?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's sort of gone wrong for Louise Haigh. You can see what she was trying to do there. She's trying to say, Andy Burnham is not going to be dropped into number 10 without any preparation at all. He's been really thinking very deeply about how to run this government and therefore don't have any worries. But of course, people have immediately seized on it and said, hold on, he's been planning for a year. It's been a terrible plot for a year. How is this going to play out?
It's going down badly among a quite significant group of people, small but significant, right? There are lots of people who feel demeaned, humiliated, hopeless for the future under Andy Burnham. I'm talking about Keir Starmer's remaining loyalists in government and on the backbenches. And they heard that yesterday, and they are still wounded. They're very upset. They're very traumatised. I imagine people are listening now and saying, get a grip, it's your fault. But anyway, these are the people who could be the awkward squad under Andy Burnham. They sort of want magnanimity. Andy Burnham wants to show them magnanimity, but they heard that and it was a dog whistle to them, which was, Louise Haigh, as you said, has been plotting for a year. They brought us down. A sample text I got yesterday, Ed. Andy is depending on the magnanimity of those of us from regional offices to party HQ and right up to the cabinet who work night and day to make our time in office a success. We want to do the same for Andy, but Lou, so proudly admitting that she was doing all she could to bring us down, disgraces her. And I'm afraid it's going to make Andy weaker too. And I got a few messages to that effect, and it is clear that there is a sort of that there's going to be a group of irreconcilables, right? People who outwardly are straining to say, I want this to succeed, but are so traumatised by everything. And sort of, feel they're out of favour and feel that, the boot is now on the other foot and the boys' club are hanging from lampposts, etc., etc. That, you can see how what leaders of the soft left were to this Prime Minister. The Starmerites could be to the next one. We'll see, the hardcore Starmerites. But, it went down badly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problems, it's interesting, the closer he gets to power, issues like Gaza, immigration are piling up. But you've got a column in The Times today about Andy Burnham's theory of power. And to be fair, it can be summed up, you summed it up in one phrase, the sort of unaccountable state. That's actually quite an attractive phrase.
Yeah, indeed. And that's a state, that's a phrase Andy Burnham said he wished he'd written in the long piece he wrote for The Times after Tony Blair slagged him off and didn't. But he's been talking about the unaccountable state. And when he talks about let's end 40 years of neoliberalism, most people hear that and think, oh, God, that's, that's wacky-backy, happy, clappy, left-wing, market-busting economics. But you'll remember, Ed, Mrs. Thatcher was doing sort of three revolutions at once. She was privatising, she was deregulating, but she was also centralising. And the power of councils, as Andy Burnham saw it, and, growing up on Merseyside in the 1980s, he spoke about, his political awakening came when he listened to Derek Hatton taking on Maggie, as he put it, on the Northwest News every night. Admittedly, then grew out of it quite quickly and got into Neil Kinnock. You had Merseyside County Council being abolished along with the other metropolitan councils. And, even when he's MP for Lee in 2001, he's talking about how power and economic power draining away, political and economic power draining away from people means that his constituents already at that point hated Parliament because it only brought them bad news and it couldn't change anything, right? His predecessor hadn't been able to change the industrialisation or anything. Then you're seeing, arm's length bodies, quangos, all of this. So, he thinks the last 40 years have been power draining away from people, both to sort of private interest, to unaccountable state interests. And it's no wonder that people are frustrated with how politics is working out and politicians are bearing the brunt because, they're elected and they can't do anything because The housing association might not have any councillors on it anymore, so they can't raise complaints and someone else's profit margin. The Environment Agency is in charge of flooding, right? Josh Simons, his predecessor, has spoken about waking up on New Year's Day in 2025, half of his constituency was underwater, and they couldn't get someone from the Environment Agency on the phone. So the firemen were just stood around saying, what do we do? And, people are looking at their local MP and his wellies saying, why can't you do anything? Because he couldn't do anything. Multi-academy trusts is the other example he gives. So all of these things, and you can tie that to what he's been saying about whipping as well, because, in his view, your elected representatives not only can't do anything, but also they're disincentivised doing things. From heavy-handed whipping, dissent is punished, making difficult decisions is punished, championing your local area when cuts across policy is punished. So all of this together, I think, explains the essence of him. Now, of course, as ever, a sincere belief is not the same as a thought-out plan. Has he met the Parliamentary Labour Party? Giving more power to councillors. Has he met half of our councillors, etc., etc.? But, as ever with Andy Burnham, I think it pays just to trace the through line of his rhetoric right back. And I often find there's a remarkable consistency there and a sort of quite coherent belief system. Yes, that'll demand quite bold solutions, but this is what he believes, and I think he means what he says on this stuff, which is going to make this very, very interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, speaking as a voter, as a punter, the unaccountable state really does speak to me. I mean, the computer says no society that we now live in is incredibly frustrating, and I do think that there's something attractive about this. We're going to be talking to one of the founders of Stonewall later in the programme about why diversity has gone so wrong, and there's an element of the unaccountable state in all of that as well. So it's going to be a fascinating thing. There are things that Andy Burnham is saying that are interesting. The question, of course, will be whether he can actually deliver, because that's the other big problem with British politics at the moment. Patrick Maguire, always an absolute pleasure to talk to you about what's going on in politics, in particular the politics of the Labour Party. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme.